The boots were sitting right outside her door when Ida Merritt opened it at dawn, and that was the moment everything inside her cracked open like dry riverbed clay after the first real rain of summer. She had not cried when her husband died. She had not cried when the bank took the farm in Abilene. She had not cried on the 3-week journey west through dust and heat and one thunderstorm that nearly swept her wagon clean off a ridge. She had not cried when she walked into the town of Redemption Creek, Texas, in October of 1882 with 43 cents in her coat pocket, and a pair of boots so worn through the soles that she could feel every pebble on Main Street through the leather like the ground itself was trying to remind her how far she had fallen. But the boots sitting outside her door at dawn, brand new, dark brown, her exact size, because he must have looked at her old ones, must have held the ruined sole in his big calloused hands and measured it against something in his memory. Those boots cracked her open. She stood in the doorway of the room above Callaway's general store, the only room she could afford for 2 nights on the arrangement she had made with old Gerald Callaway, and she pressed her hand flat against her sternum like she was trying to hold herself together from the outside. The October morning was cold and blue, and the town below was still sleeping. And Ida Merritt, who had survived everything that life had thrown at her with her chin level and her eyes dry, sat down on the threshold of that rented room and put her face in her hands and wept. She had not asked Lewis Easton for a single thing. That was the part that undid her most completely. 3 days earlier, she had not known Lewis Easton existed. She had not known Redemption Creek existed. She had been heading for Fort Worth, where a woman she'd corresponded with named Dorothy Albright had promised her work as a seamstress in her dress shop. But the wagon driver she'd paid the last of her savings to had gotten word mid-route that there was trouble in Fort Worth, a cholera outbreak quarantine, and had diverted south and deposited his passengers in Redemption Creek with a shrug and a partial refund that amounted to 60 cents and a sack of dried beans. Ida had climbed down from that wagon the way she did everything after the last 2 years of her life, with her spine straight, her jaw set, and absolutely no indication on her face that she was terrified. She had been 26 years old, a widow for 8 months, flat broke, and standing in the middle of a town she had never heard of with worn-through boots and the kind of exhaustion that lives in the bones rather than the muscles. But her head was high. It was always high. Her mother had told her when she was 7 years old that a woman's dignity was the one thing nobody could take unless she handed it over, and Ida had held onto that piece of advice like a lifeline through everything that had come after. The town of Redemption Creek in the fall of 1882 was not a large place. It had a main street of perhaps 8 establishments, a church that doubled as a schoolhouse on weekdays, a livery stable, a small hotel called the Frontier Rest that charged rates Ida could not come close to affording, and a general store run by Gerald Callaway, who was a decent enough man in the way that most men of his generation were decent. Not cruel, not warm, simply present and practical. The store also served as the town's informal postal office and gathering point. Ida had walked into Callaway's that first afternoon with her 43 cents and her dried beans, and had asked if there was any work available. Gerald Callaway had looked at her with the particular measuring gaze that men in small western towns used on women traveling alone, not unkind, but assessing, and had said there wasn't much, but that he supposed she could have the room upstairs for 2 nights if she helped his wife with the canning that needed finishing before the cold set in for good. She had said yes before he finished the sentence. She had been upstairs washing her face from the basin when she first became aware of Lewis Easton. She'd heard his voice before she saw him, low and unhurried, the kind of voice that didn't seem to work very hard to be heard, and yet carried through walls without any particular effort. He'd been talking to Gerald Callaway about a shipment of fence wire that was 2 weeks late, and there was a quality in his voice that she registered even then, through the floorboards, without knowing whose voice it was. Patience. Real patience, the kind that isn't resignation but rather a settled confidence that things will work out in their correct time. She had looked through the small window and seen him standing at the counter below. He was tall, broad through the shoulder, wearing a work coat that had seen considerable use, and a hat that had once been black and was now the color of old smoke. He had the hands of a man who worked land. She could see that even from the window. He was perhaps 30, perhaps 32. His face was angular and weather-worn in the particular way of men who spent their lives outdoors, and there was something in the set of his expression, a kind of contained attentiveness, that she noticed and then immediately told herself she had no business noticing anything about anyone right now. She had turned back to the basin and washed her hands and gone downstairs to start helping Mrs. Calloway with the canning. She met him at the counter when she came to fetch a second jar of salt. He turned when she came down the stairs, and there was a brief moment, the kind that hangs in the air between strangers before either of them have spoken, where they simply looked at each other. His eyes were gray, the precise shade of the Texas sky before rain, and they were direct without being aggressive. He nodded once politely. She nodded back. She fetched the salt. She went back to the kitchen. She did not think about him again until supper. Gerald Calloway invited him to stay for the meal, which apparently happened with some regularity since Lewis Easton owned the largest cattle operation in the surrounding 30 miles and was something of an informal town anchor, the sort of man whose presence or absence shaped the general mood of a place. Ida learned this in pieces over the course of the meal, mostly from Mrs. Calloway, a round, cheerful woman named Berta, who talked the way a warm fire burns, constantly and without apparent effort, filling all the available space with comfortable light. Ida sat at the far end of the table and ate her stew, and listened to Berta Calloway talk about the town, and watched Lewis Easton from the corner of her eye. He ate with economy, spoke when spoken to, asked Gerald a couple of practical questions about the community, and at one point helped Berta's youngest boy retrieve a spoon that had fallen under the table with the casual naturalness of a man who was comfortable with children and domestic spaces in equal measure as he was with open range. He looked at Ida twice during the meal. Both times she had been looking at him, and both times she had looked away first. After supper, she helped clear the dishes. Lewis Easton put on his hat and thanked the Calloways and paused at the door. He turned. He looked at her directly for the first time. "You just arrived," he said. It was not a question. "This afternoon," she said. "You have people here." "No, you have a plan." She looked at him with the full force of the expression she had developed over the last 8 months, the one that said she was not a charitable case, and did not require the particular brand of pity that men in cowboy hats had a tendency to extend to solitary women. "I always have a plan," she said. The corner of his mouth moved. It wasn't quite a smile. It was something more careful than that, something closer to recognition. He nodded and put his hat on and walked out the door into the October night. She stood at the sink and finished washing the dishes and told herself absolutely nothing about that exchange. She put it away in the part of her mind where she stored things she was not going to examine right now, and she went to bed. The next morning she was up before dawn, as she always was, moving quietly so as not to wake the Calloway household. She had 3 things she needed to accomplish that day. Find out whether there was any possibility of work in this town, send a letter to Dorothy Albright in Fort Worth explaining her situation and asking for advice, and figure out whether she could extend her arrangement with the Calloways or whether she needed to find alternate shelter before 2 nights were up. She came downstairs and found Lewis Easton already there. He was at the counter talking to Gerald Calloway, who had apparently opened the store early on account of the fence wire finally arriving on the morning freight. Lewis Easton had a cup of coffee in his hand and looked like a man who had been awake for hours, which Ida would later learn was always true. He kept rancher's hours, which meant he woke at 4 in the morning and did not stop working until the light was entirely gone. He looked at her when she came down. She looked back. She went to ask Gerald Calloway if she might have a piece of paper to write a letter. She wrote to Dorothy Albright at the counter while Lewis Easton and Gerald discussed fence wire 10 feet away. She was aware of him with a precision that she found irritating, the way you become aware of a splinter before you can see it, just a small point of persistent sensation. She finished the letter and sealed it and asked Gerald if it could go out with the next post rider. "Lewis takes the post down to the junction on Thursdays," Gerald said pleasantly. "He's heading down tomorrow. You could give it to him." She had turned and found Lewis Easton looking at her with that same gray, patient attention. "Happy to take it," he said. She handed him the letter. Their fingers did not touch. She thanked him and went to ask Berta Calloway if there was more she could do to be useful. She spent the day canning the last of the autumn vegetables and repairing a tear in Gerald's work jacket with a needle and thread from her bag, which she had offered to do simply because the tear had caught her eye, and she could not abide leaving something fixable unfixed. By midday, Berta Calloway was looking at her with the fond, evaluating expression of a woman who is adding up qualities in another woman and reaching a favorable sum. "There's a widow woman named Catherine Prout about 4 miles east," Berta said, handing her a cup of coffee mid-afternoon. "She's been looking for help around the house since her daughter married and moved to San Antonio. She's particular and she won't be easy to work for, but she pays honest and her house is warm." Ida set down her cup. "I'd be grateful if you'd introduce me." Berta nodded as though this had already been settled. "I'll send word with Lewis tomorrow when he goes to the junction. Catherine's place is on that road." Ida recognized, with a clarity she found uncomfortable, that Lewis Easton was becoming a recurring thread in the practical fabric of her situation. She also recognized that this was simply geography and community function, and had nothing to do with anything else. She told herself this firmly. That evening Lewis came back for supper again. Berta had apparently decided this was simply happening, and this time Ida sat closer to the middle of the table, because the bench at the far end had a loose leg that had nearly pitched her sideways the night before. This put her 3 seats away from Lewis, and they spoke for the first time as people having a conversation rather than as 2 people exchanging necessary information. It started because of the letter. He asked if she had family in Fort Worth she was trying to reach, which was a natural question since he was carrying her letter south in the morning. She explained the situation, the seamstress position, the quarantine, the wagon driver's diversion. She explained it without any particular emotion, in the practical sequential way she explained most things. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment, not the silence of a man trying to think of something to say, but the silence of a man who was actually thinking. "Dorothy Albright," he said. "Gerald, didn't Dorothy Albright's husband have dealings with the Chambers family over in Wichita County?" Gerald Calloway looked up from his bread. "That's right. John Albright's been in Wichita County since spring. There might be something in that for you," he added, addressing Ida, without elaborating on what that something might be. Lewis looked at her. "If the quarantine lifts by December and cholera moves fast once the cold sets in, Fort Worth will be accessible. If it doesn't, I'd expect Dorothy Albright has set up a shop arrangement in Wichita County in the meantime. Either way, your letter will find her." He said this the way he seemed to say most things, with a quiet certainty that wasn't arrogance, but rather confidence built on a foundation of actually thinking things through. Ida found that she believed him. She was not, as a rule, a woman who simply believed men on the strength of their tone, so this was notable. "Thank you," she said, "for carrying it." "I go that way anyway," he said. She looked at him for a long moment. He looked back. The lamp on the table was low and warm, and outside the wind had picked up, which meant the temperature would drop hard overnight, which meant the canning Berta and Ida had finished today was well timed. "How long have you been in Redemption Creek?" she asked. 7 years, he said. "Came from Missouri, bought 40 acres and built it to what it is now." "What is it now?" 800 acres, 300 head of cattle. "A ranch hand named Pinto who thinks he's funnier than he is." There it was, the almost smile again, that careful, private movement at the corner of his mouth. "It's a working life. It suits me." "You have family?" She asked it as a practical question, the same kind of question he had asked her, but she felt something in her chest that she did not entirely want to feel while asking it. "Parents are gone," he said. "Brothers in Missouri still." We write, a pause. "You?" "My mother is in Ohio. My father passed when I was 19. I was married." She said the last part matter-of-factly, as she always did, because the matter-of-fact version was the only one she could say out loud without it costing her something she could not afford to spend. "My husband died in February. Fever." Lewis Easton's expression did not shift into pity or performative sympathy, which she had learned to dread the way some people dread bad weather. He simply looked at her steadily and said, "I'm sorry," and meant it without making it into anything larger than it was. She nodded once. They did not speak much more that evening. After supper she went to help with dishes, and Lewis put on his coat and said good night to the Callaways and paused at the bottom of the stairs, not quite looking at her, in a way that made her hand slow briefly over the basin. "You've got the room upstairs," he said. "2 nights," she said. "I'm going to speak to Gerald about extending it." He nodded. He put his hat on. He left. She washed the dishes in the lamplight and listened to the wind push at the windows and thought about the particular quality of a man who didn't try to fix things for you, who just listened and said what was true and didn't make you feel smaller for needing to hear it. She told herself, firmly and for what felt like the 14th time in 24 hours, that she had more pressing things to think about. She went to bed. She woke before dawn as always, dressed in the dark as always, and opened the door of her room to go downstairs and start the morning tasks. The boots were there. Dark brown, new leather, not ostentatious or elaborate, just solid and well-made and clearly chosen by someone who understood that function and durability were more valuable than decoration. They were sitting side by side outside her door with the natural ease of something that had always been there, as if the world had simply corrected an oversight. She stood in the doorway with the cold air coming up the stairwell, and she looked at those boots for a long time. She thought about her ruined ones, which she had placed neatly beside the door last night as she always did, sole down, the way her mother had taught her. She thought about what it meant that someone had looked at those boots, not glanced at them but looked at them, with the kind of specific attention that measuring requires, and gone out in the October dark and found a pair in her size and placed them here without a note, without a word, without any mechanism by which she could be required to feel indebted or obligated or grateful in the performative way that obligation manufactures. She pressed her hand against her sternum. She sat down on the threshold. She put her face in her hands. She wept for a long time quietly, there in the cold doorway of the room above Callaway's general store, with the blue October dawn beginning to lighten the edges of the eastern sky. She wept for her husband, whom she had loved in the practical, solid way of two people who had built something together and chosen each other with clear eyes. She wept for the farm. She wept for the last 8 months. She wept for the particular exhaustion of being relentlessly strong when there is no one standing beside you. And she wept, though she could not have explained this to anyone who asked, because someone had simply noticed. She put the boots on when she was done. They fit exactly. She went downstairs. Lewis Easton was at the counter with Gerald Callaway, coffee in hand, coat on, ready to ride to the junction. He turned when he heard her on the stairs, the way he always seemed to turn when she appeared in a space, with that particular quality of attention that was neither intrusive nor accidental. She looked at him. He looked at her. She opened her mouth to say something, thank you, probably, or why, or some question that would give her the information she was looking for about what kind of man did this kind of thing. And then she closed it again, because she realized in that moment that she didn't need the answer. The boots were answer enough. The absence of obligation they carried, the refusal to make her feel smaller for needing them, the fact that he had done it in the dark without ceremony, that was the answer. They fit, was all she said. Good, was all he said. There was a pause that was not uncomfortable. Gerald Calloway, who was a perceptive man under his practical exterior, suddenly became very interested in a ledger on the counter behind him. "I'll take your letter today," Lewis said, reaching into his coat pocket and producing the letter she had given him the day before. He had kept it safe. "Thank you," she said. She meant it for more than the letter. He put on his hat. He walked to the door. He stopped with his hand on the frame and looked back at her one more time, with the gray sky eyes and the expression she was beginning to read, was allowing herself to begin to read. And then he walked out into the cold October morning and swung up on his horse and rode south. She stood in the store and watched him go. Then she took a breath and went to find Berta Calloway and ask about Catherine Prout. She went to see Catherine Prout that same afternoon, walking the 4 miles east of town in her new boots on a road edged with frost-dried grass. Catherine Prout turned out to be exactly as advertised. A 70-year-old woman with the posture of a fence post and the temperament of a hawk, who interviewed Ida at the kitchen table for 40 minutes with the thoroughness of a woman hiring for a position of considerable importance. Ida answered every question directly and without embellishment. She could cook, she said, and she was not merely being generous with the definition. She had run a household for 4 years and had grown up in a home where her mother considered cooking a form of rigor. She could sew and mend and keep accounts. She was not afraid of hard work. She did not complain as a general practice. She was a widow. She had no local connections. She required a room and reasonable pay. Catherine Prout looked at her for a long moment after this recitation and then said, "You have a reference." "Berta Calloway will speak for me," Ida said. "I've known her for 2 days, which I understand is limited, but she can tell you what she's seen." Catherine Prout's mouth did a thing that was the predecessor to a smile. "Berta Calloway's judgment I trust," she said. "You can start Monday." Ida walked back to Redemption Creek in the new boots. The leather was stiff, but the soles were whole and the cold could not get through them, and each step on the frost-hard road was solid in a way she had forgotten steps could be. Lewis Easton was back from the junction when she returned. She saw his horse outside Calloway's. She went in. He was at the counter. He looked up. "Catherine Prout is taking me on," she said. "I know it," he said, and she realized Berta must have sent word ahead with him when he'd passed Catherine's place on the road. The corner of his mouth moved. "She drives a hard bargain." "So do I," Ida said. The almost smile became something more, not quite a full smile, but real, the kind of thing that travels up to the eyes. "I expect she'll meet her match then," he said. There was a lightness between them in that moment that Ida had not felt in so long she had almost forgotten what it felt like. Like clean air after rain. Like something old and locked beginning, very slowly, to open. She extended her stay with the Calloways through the weekend. Monday morning she walked to Catherine Prout's house with her bag and her new boots and began the work of building a life in a town she had not planned to be in. The weeks that followed were full and hard, and good in the way that hard work you've chosen for yourself is good. Catherine Prout was indeed exacting. She had opinions about how laundry should be folded that could generously be described as passionate, and would more accurately be described as inflexible. But she was also fair, and she had a dry wit that revealed itself in small flashes, and she treated Ida with the particular respect that one competent woman extends to another once she has established that the competence is real. The house was warm. Ida had a room of her own, small and clean, with a window that faced east so the morning light came in first. She found that she looked forward to mornings in a way she had not for a long time. She also found that she looked forward to Thursdays, when Lewis Easton came through town to take the post to the junction, because on Thursdays she had occasion to walk into Redemption Creek for the weekly supplies Catherine needed and to stop by Calloway's. And at Calloway's, there was a reliable chance of finding Lewis Easton at the counter with his coffee. She noticed this pattern about herself with the same clear-eyed honesty she applied to most of her interior life. She did not pretend to herself that Thursday walks to town were purely about supply runs, but she also did not push past the noticing into territory that felt premature. She was 8 months out from losing her husband. She was still building the scaffolding of a new life. There were things she was not ready for and things she was not certain of, and she had learned, at some cost, that certainty about what she was feeling was important before she moved on it. But she noticed. Lewis noticed too. She could see it in the way Thursdays had a particular quality to them when she walked in. The way he was never quite in the middle of leaving when she arrived. Always had just enough business left at the counter to be there when she came through the door. She saw it in the way Gerald Calloway and Berta had developed a habit of being needed in the back room at particularly convenient moments. In November, Lewis rode out to Catherine Pruitt's on a gray Wednesday morning to deliver a parcel that Gerald said couldn't wait for Thursday because Catherine had been waiting on a specific variety of seed catalog. Ida was in the yard splitting kindling when he rode up. She was wearing her work coat and her boots. She had begun to think of them as, with a warmth she did not analyze too closely, and her hair was coming loose from its pin on one side from the exertion. He sat on his horse for a moment and looked at her in the yard. She looked back at him with the axe in her hand and her hair coming loose. Neither of them said anything for a beat. "I have a parcel for Miss Pruitt," he said. "She's inside," Ida said. He swung down and tied his horse at the post. He went inside with the parcel. He came back out 7 minutes later, and Ida had finished the kindling and was stacking it by the side of the house. He came and stood nearby without being asked and helped her stack the last of it, which was such an unaffected thing to do, so natural and undemonstrative, that she felt something in her chest go soft in a way she no longer tried to talk herself out of. "Thank you," she said. "You're welcome," he said. A pause. The November air was sharp and the dry grass was silver in the morning light, and somewhere distant a hawk was calling over the flats. "Are you settled here?" he asked. "I mean in the town, with Catherine. Are you well?" She considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "Yes," she said. "Better than I expected to be." He nodded. He looked out over the flats, then back at her. "Good," he said, in the tone that meant he was actually glad, not just being polite. She looked at him for a moment. "Why did you leave the boots?" she asked. It had been nearly 3 weeks. She had not asked until now. She wasn't sure if she was asking because she wanted the answer or because she needed to say out loud that it had mattered. He held her gaze without flinching or deflecting. "Because you walked in with your head up and your boots worn through," he said, "and you weren't going to ask anyone for anything. I thought someone should notice." She felt the words settle into her like water into dry ground. "Someone should notice," she repeated quietly. "Yes," he said. She looked at him for a long moment, the gray eyes, the honest face, the man who had gone out in the October dark to buy boots in her size without any expectation of return, and she felt the particular sensation of a door opening in a room she had thought was sealed. "Lewis," she said. She had not said his name before. They had been dancing around names the way you dance around something you're not sure is safe to touch. "Ida," he said. Another pause. The hawk called again, far away. "Would you like to come in for coffee?" she said. "Catherine won't mind." He looked at her. The almost smile came back, and this time it did go all the way up to his eyes, and it changed his face into something that was not just weathered and steady but also, unexpectedly and entirely, beautiful. "I'd like that," he said. They went inside. Catherine Pruitt, who was nobody's fool and who had been watching from the kitchen window, had the coffee ready before either of them asked. What followed was November into December, and December was the sweetest month Ida could remember in years, which should have felt strange given that it was also the hardest in objective terms. The cold was fierce. Catherine's demands were unrelenting. The letter from Dorothy Albright had come back with word that Fort Worth's quarantine was still in effect, and Dorothy had indeed moved her operations to Wichita County temporarily, meaning Ida's original plan remained inaccessible. But none of that seemed like the dominating fact of December. The dominating fact was Lewis. He found reasons to be around that were always legitimate and never forced. He brought the post. He delivered things Gerald needed taken to Catherine's Road. He happened to be in town on days that were not Thursdays. He helped Gerald Calloway re-roof the back section of the store in early December with two of his ranch hands. And Ida, who had walked to town for supplies, found herself staying longer than necessary, because the sound of hammering and the occasional exchange of voices between Lewis and his hands had a quality of ordinary human life that she had been starved of and did not want to leave too soon. They talked, in the accumulated increments of many short conversations that built steadily into something deep and layered. She learned that he had come west at 23 with almost nothing, that he had spent 2 brutal years as a hired hand before he saved enough to buy his first piece of land, that the land had been his obsession and his salvation both, the thing he had poured himself into when there was nothing else. He told her about his brother Thomas in Missouri, who had chosen a different life and was happy in it, and about his parents, who had died within a year of each other when Lewis was in his late 20s, a grief he had carried alone out here with no one to carry it with. He said this last part without self-pity, with the same quiet accuracy he used for everything, but she heard what was underneath it. She told him things she had not told anyone. About the farm in Abilene, what it had meant to her and Eli, her husband, Ida Merritt, whom she spoke about with love and steadiness and no trace of betrayal, because loving Lewis was not a betrayal of Eli. She had understood that slowly and now understood it completely. She told Lewis about the year before Eli died, when they had started to see that the farm was failing, how they had kept working anyway because what else do you do, and about the particular cruelty of losing him before they could figure out what came next together. She told him about the bank, about the auction, about selling things she had carried from Ohio, things her mother had given her to make the journey money, about the 3 weeks on the road. He listened to all of it. He never tried to fix it or reframe it or find the bright side. He just listened with his full, steady attention, and sometimes he said something that showed he had actually understood, and that was exactly what she needed. In mid-December, he asked if she would ride out to see the ranch. She said yes without hesitating, which surprised both of them slightly. She was not generally a woman who said yes without considering all the implications. And then she lifted her chin and looked at him levelly and said yes again, confirmer this time. He brought 2 horses. They rode out on a Saturday when Catherine had given her the afternoon off, out through the frost-silver flats and the pale winter grass, the sky enormous and pale blue overhead, the kind of sky that only exists in that part of Texas, so wide it makes you feel both very small and somehow freed by that smallness. The ranch was larger than she had pictured from his descriptions. The main house was a solid 2-story structure built from limestone and timber, unpretentious from the outside but warm and well-made within. He showed her the kitchen, which had a cast-iron stove he had hauled in on a wagon from Abilene 2 years prior. He showed her the barn, which was clean and orderly, the kind of barn that tells you everything you need to know about the character of the man who runs it. He introduced her to Pinto, the ranch hand who thought he was funnier than he was, who was a compact, dark-haired man of about 35 with a quick grin who looked between Lewis and Ida with undisguised delight and said, "Well, isn't that something?" in a way that made Lewis put his hat lower on his head, and Ida press her lips together to keep from laughing. She stood outside the house in the afternoon light and looked at the land, 800 acres rolling away under the great pale sky, the cattle dots in the middle distance, the windmill turning slow in the cold air, and felt something that surprised her. She felt a recognition, not of the place itself, which was new to her, but of the kind of life it represented. The hard-built, deliberately chosen, worth-the-cost kind of life. It was the same kind she had tried to build in Abilene, and standing here she felt not the loss of that one but the possibility of this one, and the distinction was significant. She turned. Lewis was watching her. "It's beautiful," she said, and meant it entirely. He looked at her with something in his eyes she could now name clearly, something she had been watching build for weeks like a slow fire that starts with just the right conditions and doesn't rush and eventually becomes exactly what it was always going to be. Ida, he said. She had come to love the way he said her name, with that same care he gave to everything. Yes, she said. I want to say something and I want to say it straight. I'd prefer nothing less, she said. He took a breath. I know you didn't plan for Redemption Creek. I know you came here by accident, and your plan was Fort Worth, and your life was already made in a direction that got broken up against your will. I know you're rebuilding. I know you're not looking for anyone to do that rebuilding for you. He paused. But I'd like to be here while you do it. I'd like to be more than Thursday mornings and wood stacking, if that's something you'd want when you're ready, if you're ready. She looked at him for a long time in the winter light. The windmill turned. The cattle were quiet in the field. The pale blue sky arched enormous overhead. I'm not entirely sure what ready looks like, she said carefully. I am sure that I haven't wanted to walk into a room in a long time as much as I want to walk into whatever room you're in. I'm sure that Thursdays have become the day my week orients itself around. I'm sure that when you looked at my boots and went out in the dark to replace them without being asked and without any requirement of gratitude, it was the most genuinely kind thing anyone has done for me in years. She paused. She could feel the heat behind her eyes, but she held it steady. I don't want to be cautious right now, she said. I have been so cautious for so long. He stepped forward. He took her hands in both of his, the large calloused hands she had noticed from the window on the first day, and he held them with a gentleness that was the same thing as the boots, attentive, careful, completely without demand. Then don't be, he said quietly. She looked up at him, this steady, patient, surprising man, and she let herself stop being cautious. Just like that. The decision made in a heartbeat after months of building toward it, like a river that has been flowing underground finally finding its way to the surface. She squeezed his hands. He squeezed back. They stood in the cold winter light on the land he had built from nothing, and it was not a dramatic moment in any external sense. No grand declaration, no performance, but it was the realest thing she had felt in years, and she held it like the gift it was. They rode back to Catherine's in the fading afternoon, and when he helped her dismount at the gate, he held her hand a beat longer than necessary before he let it go, and she walked into the house with warmth spreading through her like a banked fire coming back to life. Catherine Prout looked at her face when she came in. Catherine set down her mending. Well, she said, with the compressed satisfaction of someone who has been waiting for an event they were confident was coming. It's about time. Ida laughed. It was a real laugh, full and unguarded, and Catherine's severe face rearranged itself into something genuinely warm. Sit down, Catherine said. I'll put the kettle on. They sat at the kitchen table in the lamplight, and Catherine, who rarely talked about herself, told Ida about her late husband George, dead for 11 years, whom she had loved with the kind of love that doesn't soften or sentimentalize with time, but rather becomes more precise and more treasured. She talked about him with the same matter-of-fact honesty Ida used for Eli, and Ida understood that Catherine was telling her something important, that loving again was not a diminishment of what came before, that the heart is not a place of fixed capacity, that it builds room. Ida went to bed that night with the lamplight still warm in her memory, and something in her chest that she recognized, tentatively and gratefully, as hope. The courtship, if you could call it that, which required some generosity given how little it resembled anything formal, proceeded through January into February with the patient inevitability of two people who have both independently reached a conclusion and are simply allowing the evidence to accumulate to the appropriate threshold. Lewis came to Catherine's for Sunday supper every week, which Catherine had suggested with the brisk efficiency of a woman organizing something she approved of. He brought things, sometimes small useful things like a set of jar lids she needed, sometimes things that had no practical justification at all, like the book of poetry he left on her windowsill in January. A slim volume of Tennyson that had no note inside it but that she recognized immediately as his, the same way she had recognized the boots. She read the whole book in 3 evenings by lamplight and found certain lines that seemed to speak in his voice. The patient, certain, quietly passionate voice of a man who felt things deeply and expressed that depth in action rather than proclamation. She read them twice and then carried the book in her coat pocket for a week without quite knowing why. On a Sunday in late January, they were sitting after supper in Catherine's small parlor. Catherine had gone to bed early with a headache, leaving them with the proprietary composure of a woman who trusted her own judgment absolutely. And Lewis was telling her about a problem he was having with the east section of his fencing, and she was listening and offering thoughts, because she had grown up on a farm and understood land management better than most people credited. And at some point in the middle of a sentence about fence posts, he stopped and looked at her with the full weight of his gray eyes and said nothing for a moment. "What?" she said. "I was just thinking," he said, "that I don't know how I did Sundays before." She held his gaze. "Lewis," she said quietly. "I know," he said. "I know this is not a fast thing. I know you need time. I'm not asking for fast." "I was going to say," she said, "that I don't know either." He looked at her. She looked back. And then, with the same naturalness of breathing, he leaned forward and kissed her, gently, briefly, the kind of first kiss that asks a question rather than making a declaration. She answered it. The parlor was warm and the lamp was low, and outside the February wind was pushing at the shutters, and Ida Merritt, who had arrived in this town with nothing but her spine and her dignity and a pair of boots worn through to the sole, held Lewis Easton's face in her hands and kissed him back like a woman who has made a decision and is not afraid of it. He pulled back after a moment and looked at her, searching, making sure. "Yes," she said before he could ask. "Completely yes." He put his forehead against hers, and they stayed like that in the lamplight for a long moment, breathing the same air. February moved into March. Spring came to the Texas flats with a sudden generosity that always surprised people who hadn't seen it before. The way the brown and silver landscape shifted almost overnight into something green and gold, wildflowers appearing along the roadsides, the sky deepening from winter pale to that profound Texas blue. Lewis took her riding on Sunday afternoons when the work permitted, and he made it permit more and more, which Pinto observed with entirely undisguised satisfaction and commentary. Lewis introduced her to the full operations of the ranch on one of these Sundays, taking her through the accounting books in his study, the ledgers he kept with meticulous precision, the records of every head of cattle, every sale, every expenditure. He did this not to impress her or to display his holdings, but because he had decided she could see this, that if this was going where he intended for it to go, he wanted there to be no hidden corners, no secrets, no dark past revealed later. He showed her everything with the same open directness he brought to all their conversations. She looked at the books and found them sound. She looked at his face and found it honest. She had spent years being an excellent judge of both things. "You're asking me to trust you," she said. "I'm showing you there's nothing to distrust," he said. There was a difference and he understood it. She put the ledger down. She walked to where he was standing by the study window and she took his hand and held it. Outside the ranch was green and the cattle were moving slow in the afternoon warmth and the windmill was turning in the spring air. "Lewis," she said. She had been thinking about this for weeks. She had been thinking about it since January honestly, but had held it in the examining chamber of her mind, turning it over, looking at it from every angle with the same rigor she brought to anything important. "I want to stay," she said. "Not at Catherine's, here, in Redemption Creek with you, if that's," she paused, "if that's what you're hoping for." He turned to look at her. His expression was the most completely open she had ever seen it, the careful containment he maintained as a default entirely absent. "It's the thing I hope for most," he said. She nodded once crisply because some things were resolved by a decision and then the work of carrying it out, and she was ready for the work. "Then let's do it right," she said. "I want Catherine to know first. I want to give her time to find someone else." "Of course," he said. "And I would want to write to my mother," she said. "She deserves to know." "Absolutely," he said. A pause. She looked at him with a question she had not yet formed into words. He answered it anyway. "There is a circuit preacher who comes through every 6 weeks," he said. "The next time is mid-April." She felt warmth flood through her, and also a shimmer of something that was not quite fear but was adjacent to it, the awareness of the magnitude of what she was choosing. She held it alongside the certainty that it was right and found that the certainty won, clearly and without drama. "Mid-April," she said. "If that's enough time," he said. She looked at him, the honest face, the gray eyes, the man who had noticed her worn boots and gone out in the dark. And she thought that 8 months of grief and 3 weeks on the road and all the loss that had come before had in some oblique and terrible way led her to this moment, to this man, to this particular grace. "It's enough time," she said. She told Catherine Prout that same evening. Catherine sat at the kitchen table and listened without expression while Ida explained, carefully and fully, what she had decided and why and what the timeline looked like. When Ida finished, Catherine was quiet for a long moment. "You're certain?" Catherine said. It was not a question, but Ida answered it anyway. "More certain than I've been about anything in 2 years," she said. Catherine nodded with the single, precise nod of someone updating their records. "He's a good man," she said. "I have watched Lewis Easton build that ranch from 40 acres with nothing but work and principle. I have watched him be honest when it was costly and fair when he had no obligation to be. You could do a great deal worse." She paused. "You could also do worse than staying on here, and I'll not pretend otherwise, but I understand this is not the life you're choosing and I respect the choice." She cleared her throat. "I'll need 2 months to find someone suitable." "You have 6 weeks," Ida said. "I'll work the full 6 weeks and I'll write you letters of recommendation for prospective candidates, and I will teach whoever you hire where everything is kept." Catherine Prout's severe face shifted into that rare, genuine warmth. "I told Berta Calloway 3 days after you arrived," she said, "that you were the most capable woman I'd met in a decade. I see I was right to modify that to ever." Ida laughed and leaned forward and took Catherine's dry, papery hand in both of hers and held it. Catherine allowed this for exactly 3 seconds and then extracted her hand and stood up and said something about the morning tasks, which was her way of dealing with emotion, and Ida loved her for it. She wrote to her mother that night. Her mother, Margaret Crane Merritt, was 63 years old and living with Ida's younger sister in Columbus, Ohio, and she was the kind of woman who had raised Ida to be the woman. Ida was spine straight, eyes dry, head high, and Ida wrote to her honestly, the way they had always communicated without decoration or apology. She told her about Lewis, about the boots, about the ranch, about mid-April. She told her that she was well and settled, and had found something she had not been looking for, and was not going to walk away from on account of caution, which she expected her mother to understand. Her mother's reply came in late March, and it was 3 pages long, and it ended, "You have always known your own mind better than anyone I've met. Trust it. I am glad for you, my Ida. And tell this Lewis Easton that if he is half the man you describe, he already has my blessing, and if he is the full man you describe, he is more than most women ever find. Your father would have liked a man who notices things." Ida read the letter 4 times at the kitchen table, and then folded it very carefully and put it in the inside pocket of her coat, against her chest. She showed it to Lewis the next Thursday. He read it quietly in the store while Gerald conspicuously reorganized the sugar sacks behind him. When he finished, he folded it with the same care she had and handed it back to her. "Your mother is remarkable," he said. "She'd say the same about you if she'd met you," Ida said. He met her eyes. "I'd like her too," he said. "Someday." "Someday," Ida agreed. April came. The world turned green. Redemption Creek in the spring had a quality she had not been there to experience before. A loosening, a brightening, the way a community shifts when winter releases it. People more frequently outdoors, children running in the street, the general store busier and noisier. She found she loved it. She found she loved most things about this town that she had not planned to stay in. Lewis proposed formally 2 weeks before the preacher was due, not because it was necessary. They had already decided, already discussed the practical arrangements, and both of them knew that, but because he wanted to do it properly. He came to Catherine's on a Sunday, and Catherine withdrew to the garden with the intentionality of a theatrical director, and Lewis took a small ring from his coat pocket and held it out. It was simple, a thin band of gold with a small garnet set in it, unpretentious and exactly right. "Ida," he said, "I want to build a life with you. Everything I have is yours, honestly and completely. I want you to be my wife." She looked at the ring. She looked at his face. "Yes," she said, the same way she had said it in the parlor in February, without qualification, without reservation, with the full weight of a woman who has examined her own heart and found her conclusion clean. He slid the ring on her finger. It fit as if it had always been there. She cupped his face in her hands. "Lewis," she said quietly. "I know," he said. "Do you?" she said. "Yes," he said. "Completely yes." He said it with the warmth of a man who remembers everything, who has held every word she's ever said to him with the same care he'd given those boots. She kissed him in Catherine Prute's parlor in the April afternoon, while the windows were full of spring light, and the smell of the blooming Texas country came through on the warm air. The circuit preacher came through Redemption Creek on a Tuesday in mid-April 1883, and married Ida Merritt and Lewis Easton in the church that doubled as the schoolhouse, with Gerald and Berta Calloway standing as witnesses and Catherine Prute in the front pew in a dark blue dress that was clearly her best, and that she wore with the dignity of someone attending an event they consider to be of real importance. Pinto stood in the back in a clean shirt that was only slightly too large for him, and cried without any apparent embarrassment, which Ida found both startling and completely endearing. The ceremony was simple and brief, and entirely right. The preacher was a thin, energetic man from somewhere in Arkansas who had been doing these circuits for 20 years, and who had the gift of making the words feel new, not worn down by repetition. When he asked Lewis if he took this woman, Lewis looked at Ida, not at the preacher, at Ida, and said yes with the steadiness of a man who has never been more sure of anything in his life. When he asked Ida, she looked at Lewis and said yes with her chin level and her eyes clear, and the full conviction of a woman who has chosen with her whole self. The small congregation in the schoolhouse church applauded when the preacher pronounced them married, which was not a formal part of the ceremony but was entirely appropriate. Berta Calloway was weeping openly. Gerald Calloway's face was doing something complicated that was probably also weeping but that he would never have admitted to. Lewis kissed her there in the church, and she held his hand with both of hers and felt the ring on her finger and the spring air coming in through the open door and the warmth of this community that had become hers, this accidental town, these unexpected people. And she thought about the morning she had arrived, 3 weeks on a wagon, 43 cents in her pocket, boots worn through to the sole. She thought about the door opening at dawn and the boots sitting there, dark and new and perfect. She thought about the long thread that ran from that moment to this one, through every Thursday and every Sunday supper and every conversation in lamplight, through January kisses and April promises and a ring that fit as if it had always been there. She thought about her mother's letter. Your father would have liked a man who notices things. Lewis squeezed her hand. She looked up at him. "Ready?" he said quietly. "For what?" she asked. "The rest of it," he said. She looked at him, this man who had built 800 acres from nothing, who had gone out in the October dark to buy boots for a woman he had known for one day, who had never tried to fix her or shrink her or make her feel small for needing things, who had been patient and honest and solid and surprising in equal measure. "Yes," she said. "Let's go home." They rode out to the ranch in the April afternoon, the two of them side by side on horseback, the Texas country spread out green and gold under the enormous blue sky. Pinto had gone ahead to put things in order, and when they arrived he had made a visible effort to decorate the main room with some dried wildflowers and a tablecloth he had borrowed from somewhere, which was an act of such sincere and slightly disastrous sweetness that Ida went directly to him and shook his hand and told him it was perfect, which made him flush to his ears. "You'll be trouble," he told her, with the grin of a man who is entirely delighted by this prospect. "Probably," she agreed. Lewis looked between the two of them with an expression of fond and resigned amusement that she filed away with all the other expressions she had collected. The almost smile, the gray sky attention, the full-face warmth she'd first seen outside in the December cold, building a language between them that was entirely their own. That first year of their marriage was the fullest year Ida had known. She took on the management of the ranch house and found, to neither of their surprise, that she was exceptionally good at it. Not just the domestic management, but the broader organizational logic, the supply tracking, the accounting she had offered to take over when she discovered that Lewis kept the books accurately but spent far more time on them than necessary. She developed a system that cut his bookkeeping time in half and extended it to cover projections for the following season, which made him look at her one evening over the account books with something between wonder and pure love and say, "Where did you come from?" in a way that was not really a question. "Ohio," she said. "Originally. Thank God for wagon drivers who take the wrong road," he said. She laughed. He laughed. Outside, the Texas night was warm and starlit and enormous. She wrote to Dorothy Albright in Wichita County and explained the whole extraordinary sequence of events. The quarantine diversion, Redemption Creek, Lewis Easton, the ranch, and Dorothy's reply came with a warmth and humor that suggested she was exactly the kind of woman Ida would have liked very much, and that she hoped the cholera quarantine, which was finally lifted from Fort Worth, would someday allow them to actually meet. Ida wrote back and invited her to come visit whenever she was inclined, and she meant it. She wrote to her mother every 2 weeks with the careful regularity of a daughter who understands that her mother's worry is an expression of love, and that the best antidote for worry is information. She described the ranch, the town, Lewis, Pinto's continued comedic ambitions, Catherine Prout, who came to Sunday supper once a month with the composure of a woman accepting a thing she has decided to accept with full grace. Her mother's letters back were long and warm and full of news of Columbus that she had not previously been very interested in, but found she now read with a kind of tender attachment. The detail of a life that had shaped her, seen from the distance that makes the shape clear. In the summer, a thing happened that shook the community and tested Ida and Lewis in a way that the ordinary hardships of ranch life had not. A man came to Redemption Creek in July, claiming to be an agent of a land acquisition company out of Dallas, carrying papers that he claimed documented a prior claim on a section of land that overlapped the eastern boundary of Lewis's 800 acres. His name was Harlan Webb, and he had the smooth, careful manner of a man who had practiced looking trustworthy. The claim was technically complex, and the papers were officially stamped, and Lewis, reading them at Gerald Calloway's counter with Ida standing next to him, could see that the situation was going to be difficult and potentially costly. Lewis read the papers twice without expression. He handed them to Ida. She read them once. "These numbers are wrong," she said. She pointed to a sequence of survey coordinates in the legal description. "The eastern boundary is misdescribed here. See this? The reference point they're using doesn't match any of the established survey markers in this county. I've seen the maps in Gerald's records." Gerald Calloway looked at the papers. He looked at the coordinates. He looked at Ida. "She's right," he said, with the tone of a man who is both impressed and relieved. Harlan Webb's smooth manner developed a slight tremor around the edges. Lewis looked at Ida with the quiet, certain warmth of a man who has married someone who continues to exceed even his estimation. He looked at Harlan Webb. "I suggest," he said, in the unhurried voice that carried without effort, "that you take your paperwork back to whoever prepared it and have them check the survey coordinates against the county records before you proceed. I'll be consulting the county surveyor myself this week." Harlan Webb left Redemption Creek the following morning. The claim was never refiled. Lewis took the maps to the county seat 2 weeks later and had the boundary formally reconfirmed, which was money and time spent but was the right thing to do, and he noted in the new ledger entry Ida's role in catching the discrepancy, writing simply, "Ida, as per usual." She found that entry on a Tuesday afternoon when she was updating the books and had to sit very still for a moment before she could continue. The summer moved into fall, and fall brought with it the first anniversary of her arrival in Redemption Creek. She noted it quietly to herself on an October morning, standing on the porch of the ranch house with her coffee cup, looking out at the land that was golden and enormous in the autumn light. 1 year ago she had climbed down from a wagon with 43 cents and a pair of boots with no soles. 1 year ago she had walked into Callaway's general store with her head high and her future entirely uncertain. She stood on her porch in the October morning light and thought about all of it, the fear she had never let show, the exhaustion, the long thread of hard days that had somehow, by a turn of road and a quarantine and a wagon driver who didn't know where else to take his passengers, led her here. To this land. To this man. She heard the door behind her, and then Lewis was beside her, his own coffee cup in hand, his coat pulled on against the October chill, and he stood next to her and looked out at the land the way they often stood together in the morning, not always needing words, having built over this year the particular comfort of shared silence that is one of the deepest intimacies there is. "It's been a year," she said. "I know," he said. She looked at him, he looked back. She thought about the boots. She thought about the door, early morning, the pale blue October dawn. "I never said thank you," she said. "Not properly, for the boots." "You didn't need to," he said. "I know I didn't need to," she said. "I want to." She turned to face him fully, this man who had become the center of her life with the certainty and rightness of something that was always going to be true. "You saw me. On one day, after one evening at supper. You saw me and you went and found exactly what I needed and you gave it to me without any expectation of return. I have thought about that more times than I can count, what it means about who you are." He looked at her with the full gray sky attention. "It means I was paying attention," he said simply. "Lewis," she said. "Ida," he said. She stepped into him and he put his arm around her and they stood on the porch of the ranch house they were building a life in, looking out at 800 acres of Texas in the October morning, and she felt the completeness of it, not perfect, because nothing is perfect, and she was a woman who respected that, but full. Genuinely, deeply, abundantly full. "I'm going to tell you something," she said, still looking out at the land. "All right," he said. She let a moment pass. The morning was very quiet except for the windmill, and the cattle and a bird somewhere on the fence line. She held the warmth of what she was about to say close for one more second, savoring it, and then she turned to look at his face when she said it. "I'm going to have a baby," she said. She watched the expression move across his face, the first flicker of comprehension, then the widening, the absolute flooding warmth that came up from somewhere very deep in him and rearranged everything. His eyes going bright in the way she had seen them go bright only in moments of the realest feeling. He set his coffee cup on the porch rail very carefully, the kind of careful that happens when your hands have suddenly become the most important things in the world. "Ida," he said, and his voice had changed, had lost its habitual steadiness for once, had gone soft and rough at the edges. "March, I think," she said. "I wanted to be certain before I told you." He took her face in both hands and looked at her with everything he had, with the full open frankness of a man who does not hide what he feels when it matters, and she looked back with her chin level and her eyes clear, and her heart so full she was not sure how she was still standing. He kissed her, there on the porch in the October morning. She laughed against his mouth. She couldn't help it, the joy of it too large to be entirely contained. "A baby," he said, pulling back enough to look at her again as if checking that this was real. "A baby," she confirmed. He put his hands on her shoulders, then pulled her into his arms, and she felt his heartbeat under her ear going faster than usual, which was perhaps her favorite thing she had ever discovered about him, that under the patience and the steadiness and the controlled exterior, his heart could move like this. "Everything is going to be different," he said into her hair. "Everything is going to be exactly what it should be," she said. The winter of 1883 into 1884 was the warmest and best winter Ida had known since her childhood, which she attributed partly to the Texas climate and partly to the bone-deep happiness of a life that was building towards something. She was well through the pregnancy, robustly well in the way of a woman who has always been fundamentally strong, though the first months brought a fatigue that she found humbling, and which Lewis managed with the same quiet attentiveness he brought to everything, appearing with food before she knew she was hungry, rearranging the workload without being asked, so that the heaviest tasks disappeared from her sphere without comment. She appreciated it immensely and told him so, which made him slightly embarrassed in the particular way of men who do not quite know what to do with being thanked for things they consider simply obvious. Berta Calloway came out twice a month, and was an inexhaustible source of practical wisdom, having raised 4 children of her own, delivered with the matter-of-fact efficiency of a woman for whom no aspect of the physical reality of babies was either mysterious or alarming. Catherine Prout came on a Sunday in December and brought a crib she said she had no use for, which she delivered with the brisk efficiency of a business transaction, while her eyes were doing something Ida recognized as love. Pinto knitted something. It was unclear what it was supposed to be. He described it as a blanket, but it was roughly the dimensions of a postage stamp, and entirely the wrong shape. But the fact of it was so sincere and so valiant that it went onto the shelf in the nursery and stayed there. Lewis's brother Thomas wrote from Missouri when Lewis's letter about the baby arrived. A long, warm letter full of genuine gladness and some fraternal humor, and enclosed a carved wooden horse he had made himself, saying he reckoned it would be some months before the recipient could use it, but that he thought it worth sending early because woodworking took time, and he'd started it the moment he got the news. Ida read the letter twice and decided that she loved Thomas Easton sight unseen, and that she was going to make Lewis take her to Missouri when the baby was old enough to travel. The baby arrived in early March 1884, ahead of schedule by 2 weeks, which meant it arrived on a Tuesday afternoon when the spring thaw was just beginning to lighten the landscape and the first tentative wildflowers were starting along the road. It was a boy, a healthy and emphatic boy who announced his arrival with considerable vocal conviction. Lewis, who had been downstairs in an agony of helpless patience, while Berta Calloway attended upstairs, came into the room when Berta called him and stood in the doorway looking at Ida in the bed and the child in her arms with an expression that stripped all the usual architecture from his face and left only pure, unguarded awe. She held the baby up slightly so he could see. He crossed the room in 3 steps and sat on the edge of the bed and looked at his son, this small, fierce, red-faced person who had just entered the world with such conviction. And then he looked at Ida, and she saw his eyes were bright. "He's very loud," Lewis said, in the tone of someone very moved trying very hard to sound practical. "He's yours," Ida said. "What did you expect?" Lewis made a sound that was partly a laugh and partly something else entirely. He put his large, calloused hand very gently on the baby's head, a hand that was big enough to cover most of it, and held it there with the devastating tenderness of a man discovering something entirely new in himself. They named him George, for Catherine Prout's late husband, which made Catherine's face do things that Ida thought she would treasure for the rest of her life. George Lewis Easton grew from a loud, emphatic baby into a loud, emphatic toddler with his father's gray eyes, and his mother's absolute refusal to be deterred by obstacles. He walked at 9 months, which was early, and spent the next months covering the ranch house with the determined speed of a person who has decided that the world is for exploring and has no intention of waiting to be carried. The ranch continued to grow. Lewis took on 2 additional hands in the spring of 1885, expanding the cattle operation into a section of the East Range that had been underused, and Ida took on the correspondence and supply contracts that the expansion required with the same systematic efficiency she had brought to everything else. They worked alongside each other with the natural complementarity of two people whose strengths are genuinely aligned, each making the other's work better. And there was a satisfaction in this, in the daily, practical, earned satisfaction of building something together, that Ida had not been certain she would find again after losing the Abilene farm, and finding it was a continuous, quiet joy. In the summer of 1885, a letter came from Dorothy Albright in Fort Worth. The quarantine long since lifted and Dorothy's shop fully re-established, saying that she planned to visit a friend in Abilene in the fall, and would Ida consider a slight detour through Redemption Creek. Ida wrote back within 24 hours. Dorothy came in September, a small, bright-eyed woman of 32 with a quick mind and opinions on everything, and a warmth that explained immediately why she and Ida had become correspondents who felt like friends long before they were. She stayed 4 days and spent most of them at the ranch house, and on the last evening she told Ida, across the supper table with Lewis and George and Pinto, and a laughing general conversation going on around them, that she was deeply glad the cholera quarantine had redirected a particular wagon south. "So am I," Ida said, looking across the table at Lewis, who was currently engaged in the complex operation of convincing George to eat something that was not bread, a negotiation he was losing with good humor. Dorothy looked between them with the expression of someone observing a thing that is genuinely good and knowing it. "I've been watching him with you all evening," she said quietly. "He watches you like you're the thing he was waiting to understand." Ida looked at Lewis again, the gray sky eyes, the patient hands, the man who had noticed, and felt the familiar warmth move through her like a current. "He noticed my boots," she said simply, which was not an explanation any stranger would understand but was the entire truth of it. Dorothy looked at her with a question in her eyes. So Ida told her the story. The whole thing, from the wagon and the 43 cents and the borrowed room above Callaway's general store, to the door at dawn and the boots sitting there, perfect and brown and undemanding. She told it the way she thought about it, which was as a story about being seen at the exact moment when you need someone to see you, and have not asked anyone to look. Dorothy listened with her chin in her hand and her eyes bright, and when Ida finished she said, "Someone should write that down." "I have," Ida said. "In letters to my mother she has them all." The fall of 1885 brought something new. Ida found in November that she was expecting again. This time she told Lewis immediately, the same evening, because she had learned from George that the waiting to be certain was not something she could manage. She wanted him to know when she knew. He had been at the desk with the account books when she came in. He looked up. She told him. He stood and came to her in 2 steps and held her face and looked at her with the same flooding warmth as the first time, which she had been a little afraid would be somehow less the second time and was not, was just as complete and just as deep. "March again," he said. "June, I think," she said. "Better timing," he said, which was a reference to the fact that George's early March arrival had come in the tail of the worst cold snap of the winter. "I thought so," she said. She pressed her palm flat against his chest and felt his heartbeat. "We're going to have a full house," she said. "That's the plan," he said. She looked up at him. "Is it? Isn't it yours?" She thought about it, the ranch house, the land, the community, Lewis, George. This life she had not planned and had built anyway from nothing but 43 cents and a willing spine. "Yes," she said. "That's exactly my plan." He kissed her in the lamplight of the study with the account books open on the desk behind them and the November wind outside and the warm Texas night settling in around the house. The baby born in June of 1886 was a girl. She came in the early morning, with June light already warming the room, and she was dark-haired and quiet where George had been fair and loud, and she looked up at the world from her first moments with the wide, considering gaze of someone who intends to understand exactly what she has arrived in before she makes any judgments about it. They named her Margaret, for Ida's mother. When the letter reached Columbus, Ohio, Ida's mother wrote back the longest letter she had ever written, 14 pages that covered every aspect of her joy and her pride and her love, and some practical observations about baby girls that were delivered with the characteristic Crane family briskness. She also announced in the final page that she intended to come visit in the fall because she was 67 years old and in excellent health, and she had never met her grandchildren and she did not see what was stopping her. Lewis, reading this over Ida's shoulder, said, "Good." Ida looked at him. "She will have opinions about how we do things." "She raised you," he said. "Her opinions will probably be right." Ida laughed and leaned back against him and looked at the letter and thought about her mother making the journey west. This woman who had shaped her into herself, coming to see the life that had been built from the ruins of another life. She thought about what her mother would see when she arrived: the ranch, the land, George with his gray eyes and his refusal to be deterred, baby Margaret with her considering gaze, Lewis at the door coming in from the range. She thought about what her mother would think when she understood the full story, which she knew in letters but had not seen. She thought her mother would understand exactly what she had found. Margaret Crane Merritt arrived in October of 1886, 4 years to the month after Ida had arrived in Redemption Creek. She came by stage from Abilene, not by wagon, and she came with 2 trunks and the posture of a woman who has been growing a particular spine for 67 years and has no intention of stopping. Ida drove out to meet the stage with Lewis and George and baby Margaret, and when the stage stopped and the door opened and her mother descended, Ida stood and looked at her for a moment with her eyes full. Her mother looked back. Her mother looked at Lewis. She looked at George, who was 2.5 and regarding his grandmother with the same gray-eyed patience he had inherited from his father. She looked at baby Margaret in Ida's arms. Then she looked at Ida's face, the full, open, entirely visible happiness in it, and her own composed face shifted into something that was love without any qualification. "You look well," her mother said. "I am well," Ida said. "Come and meet Lewis." She watched Lewis take her mother's hand and say that he was glad she had come, and watched her mother examine him with the precise, thorough gaze she had always used on things that mattered, and watched her mother nod once, the same decisive nod Ida used when she had made a judgment and was satisfied with it. "You are the man who noticed her boots," her mother said. Lewis looked at her steadily. "Yes, ma'am." "Good," her mother said, in exactly the tone Ida would have used, and turned to look at the wagon. "Now let's get these trunks loaded before that wind picks up." Ida stood in the October afternoon light and watched Lewis take the first of her mother's trunks and put it in the wagon with the same easy capability he brought to everything, and watched George attach himself to his grandmother's hand with complete confidence, and watched her mother look down at the boy with an expression that cracked open something ancient and tender in her face. She pressed her palm against her sternum for a moment, just briefly, the way she had done on the threshold of the room above Callaway's General Store 4 years ago when she had first found the boots and wept. Only this time she was not holding herself together. This time she was holding something in the sheer fullness of it, the extraordinary improbable rightness of a life she had not planned and would not have traded for any other. She lowered her hand. She lifted her chin. She walked to the wagon. Her mother's visit lasted 6 weeks and was one of the best 6 weeks of Ida's adult life. Her mother had opinions about the kitchen arrangement and expressed them fully, and Ida agreed with half of them and pushed back on the other half with the particular fluency of a woman debating her equal, and they both enjoyed this enormously. Her mother had opinions about the account system. Ida had developed and studied it for a full afternoon, and then said it was better than anything she'd seen, which from Margaret Crane Merritt was the equivalent of a standing ovation. Her mother and Lewis had long conversations in the evenings that Ida sometimes sat beside and sometimes left them to, because she could see that her mother was investigating him, was running the full long assessment she applied to everything that mattered to her daughter, and she was not at all worried about the outcome. On the 3rd week she came in from the garden to find her mother and Lewis at the kitchen table with coffee, and the conversation stopped when she came in, and both of them had the particular expression of people who have been talking about her with genuine affection. "What?" she said. "Nothing," her mother said. Lewis pressed his lips together. "You are both terrible liars," Ida said, and went to put the kettle on. "I was telling him about the time you were 14 and negotiated a formal contract with your father over the terms of your household duties," her mother said. "And what did he say to that?" Ida said. "He said he wasn't surprised," her mother said. Ida looked at Lewis over her shoulder. He looked back with the full, open, entirely visible warmth she had learned over 3 years to know as the clearest expression of what he felt for her. "Smart man," Ida said. He caught her hand as she passed and held it briefly, just a touch, just the warmth of his palm against hers, and let it go. Her mother went back to Columbus in December, on a day that was cold and clear, and at the stage she held Ida's face in her dry, papery hands the way Ida had held Catherine Pruitt's hands on the night she'd gotten engaged, and she looked at her daughter with everything she was feeling visible in her face. "You did exactly right," her mother said. "I know," Ida said. "Yes," her mother said. "You always do." She released Ida's face and turned to Lewis and shook his hand with the formal gravity of a transaction being solemnized. "Take care of what you have here," she said. "Every day," Lewis said. Her mother nodded. She got on the stage. She was gone. Ida stood and watched the stage until it disappeared around the southern bend of the road. Lewis stood beside her. George was between them, holding each of their hands with the comfortable ownership of a child who has never had occasion to doubt his security. "She approved," Lewis said. "She approved 2 days after she arrived," Ida said. "She just needed the remaining 5 weeks to tell you in detail what she expects of you." "I made notes," he said. She looked at him. He was entirely serious. She laughed and leaned into him, and he put his arm around her, and they stood in the December cold watching the empty road, while George made observations about the stage's departed horses that were practical and specific, and entirely his father's son. The years built on each other with the particular richness of a life that is genuinely lived. George grew into a boy of formidable curiosity and considerable stubbornness, who had strong opinions about ranch operations that Lewis had begun, carefully and seriously, to educate because the opinions showed a real understanding of what mattered. Margaret grew into a child whose quiet considering gaze resolved into a kind of thoughtful attentiveness that reminded Ida, with a pang of pure tenderness, of Lewis watching her from across Gerald Calloway's counter on that first evening. In 1888, a third child came, another boy, born in September, who was named Eli after Ida's first husband, which had been Lewis's suggestion. She had looked at him for a long time when he suggested it, reading every layer of what was behind it, and had found only honesty, the honest acknowledgement that Ida Merritt had been a real man who had mattered to the woman Lewis loved, and that there was room in their life to honor that without it threatening anything. "You're sure," she had said. "He was your husband," Lewis said. "He was part of what made you who you are, and you are the most remarkable thing I have encountered in my life. I'd like to acknowledge that." He paused. "Besides, it's a good name." She had put her arms around him and held him hard for a long moment. Little Eli was a cheerful child from the first, with an easy disposition and his mother's brown hair, who took to the ranch from the time he could walk with the specific joy of a person who has found their element. He followed Pinto around from the age of 2 with a devotion that Pinto received with enormous pride and used to great comic effect. Pinto was still there. He would always be there. He had been offered positions at larger operations twice in those years, and had declined both times with the particular casualness of a man who knows exactly where he belongs. He had become, in the way of such things, family and Christmas at the Easton Ranch was not complete without Pinto at the table saying something that he considered hilarious, and that Ida considered endearing even when it wasn't funny, which was most of the time, though she would never have told him so. In 1889, Redemption Creek grew. A new family arrived, the Darby family from Kansas, and then a schoolteacher named James Holt, and then a doctor, an actual doctor, a young man named Peter Walsh who had trained in Philadelphia and come west because the frontier needed medicine and he needed to be useful. His arrival was cause for genuine celebration in the community, and Lewis and Gerald Calloway organized the practical arrangements for establishing a proper medical room in a building that had been sitting empty behind the hotel. Ida, who had by this point become one of the more influential organizing forces in Redemption Creek's civic life, by the simple mechanism of being good at getting things done and willing to say what needed saying, was part of the committee that welcomed Dr. Walsh and ensured he had what he needed to begin practice. She did this with her characteristic efficiency and without any particular self-congratulation, because it needed doing and she was the person who could do it, and that was the whole of the logic. Lewis, watching her at the welcome dinner for Dr. Walsh, said nothing until they were home and the children were in bed and the house was quiet. Then he said, "You know what you've built here?" "We've built," she said, correcting him automatically. "Yes," he said, "but you especially." She looked at him across the lamplight. "I arrived here by accident," she said. "The best things are usually accidents," he said. She thought about the quarantine, the wagon driver, the 43 cents and the beans and the room above Calloway's and the cold October dawn and the boots. She thought about one particular moment in a series of accidents that had felt, with the accumulation of everything that had come after, less like accident and more like arrival. "Not all of them," she said. She looked at him directly. "Some things are chosen." He held her gaze with the full gray sky attention. "Yes," he said, "they are." She stood and went to him at the desk, and he turned in the chair, and she sat on the edge of it, and he put his arm around her, and they stayed like that in the lamplight, while the October wind moved outside and the children slept, and the windmill turned in the night, and the land that was theirs stretched away in all directions under the enormous Texas sky. She thought about a woman she had been 3 years before that, alone, afraid under the composure, heading somewhere she never reached, carrying the weight of everything that had been lost. She thought about that woman walking into a town she'd never planned to be in with her head high and her boots worn through. She thought about what it means to be seen, not watched, not assessed, not measured against someone's expectations, but seen. The particular grace of another person's genuine attention, given freely and without demand. She turned her face into Lewis's shoulder. He tightened his arm around her. "Lewis," she said. "I know," he said. She smiled against his coat. "Do you?" "Yes," he said, in the voice she had loved from the first evening through all the months and years after, unhurried, quiet, certain as the land itself. "Everything." She sat with him in the lamplight of the house they had built on the land he had made from nothing, with their 3 sleeping children and the windmill turning and the October country dark and starlit outside. And she felt the complete rightness of it, not perfect, not without its costs and its griefs and its ongoing hard work, but right in the way of a life that has been genuinely chosen, fully inhabited, built with honest hands and kept with honest hearts. A life that had started, against all probability, with a pair of boots sitting outside a door at dawn. She had arrived with her head high and her boots worn through. He had new ones at the door by morning. And everything that had come after, the coffee at Gerald's counter, the almost smiles, the winter rides and the spring promises, the ring that fit, the children who were their best argument for the future, the community they had helped to build, the years still ahead of them, wide as the Texas sky and full of everything, all of it traced back to that single thread of attention, that one act of genuine noticing. She carried it with her the way she had once carried her mother's letter in the inside pocket of her coat against her chest where the heart is. The house was warm. The children were sleeping. The windmill turned. She was home.